Hi, class. So we're going to talk about chapter 3, and that is all about corporate social responsibility. And what is corporate social responsibility? It is what businesses do above and beyond making a profit. So if they are sustainable, if they're helping the environment, if they support the community, anything outside of just making goods or services and selling them and making a profit off of it, that's corporate social responsibility. And so this chapter is kind of looking at once again, what is it and why do businesses need to do it? Or do they need to do it? And what are the arguments for businesses participating in it or not participating in it? And so it takes a bunch of different models and we look at kind of those models or those theories on why businesses should or should not participate in corporate social responsibility. So the first one is the economic model, and that is probably the most traditional model. It's the idea that businesses only should make profit. That should be their only goal. That should be their only objective is to just make a profit as long as they're following the law. So they should go after whatever it takes to do that. They should not ethically do anything outside of just making a profit. That is their only responsibility because all their responsibility is to their shareholders. And the shareholders are people who own stock in the company. And they're investors and they're owners of the company by owning the stock or shares of the company. And so the business must make a profit and then it can divest that profit to its shareholders and make money for its owners. And there are two arguments that they talk about for the economic model is that it's utilitarianism, um, to give profits to the shareholders. It produces the most amount of happiness both for the shareholders, for the employees of the company that are making the profit, and then also for consumers. It's giving consumers what they want. That's why they're making such a good profit. And so it says that most amount of people are happy from that thing. The other argument is that there's businesses are private property. So what that means is like as an owner, I own a business. As a shareholder, I own a business. And that if you as a manager decide to take the profits from that business and use it for socially responsible things, then you're stealing from me. Those profits should have been going to me as the owner because it's the business is private property. And so those are the two main arguments for the economic model. And we then go into um, some arguments against that model. And they're very thorough on these arguments, so I'll try to get through most of them. But so there's two arguments against the utilitarianism theory that it produces the most good for the most amount of people. And the argument number one is that the pursuit of profit does not always maximize happiness. And so just following the free market, letting businesses do what they do, letting them just go out and make a profit, all the costs are not always factored in to those transactions, and therefore people get hurt or there's harm caused even when they are just doing their thing and trying to make a profit. The first is the case of externalities. Externalities are things that occur outside of a business transaction. So a good example is pollution. If you have a factory and you're producing goods and you're causing pollution, and you're selling your goods, the people who are buying the goods aren't necessarily the ones who are impacted by the pollution that you cause. So there's other people that aren't part of the transaction or aren't buying your goods that are impacted by the pollution, but you're not, they have to bear that cost, the cost of the pollution. And the next case is public goods, and those are goods that don't have a price, like clean air. Like we all appreciate and enjoy clean air and being able to breathe clean air, right? But if a factory is causing issues and belching smoke and making the air not clean, are they coming to my house and paying me for taking away that clean air? Even though I value that clean air and they took it, they're not paying me for the value of that clean air. So that's another issue. And then finally, the argument is that the economic model argues that competition is the best thing and you should just be competitive and be in the market. And if you're not being competitive in the market and going after profits, then it's bad for people. But sometimes being cooperative with other entities is a beneficial thing and it is good. And so ignoring that aspect is a mark against the economic model. And it argues that individual decisions are not always the best decisions. Like sometimes an individual decision might seem rational, but it's actually not in the best interest of everyone. So the argument against those arguments would be that, okay, yeah, that's great. We have the government to put laws in place against pollution and all that kind of thing. So they just need to put those laws in place and then businesses will follow them and they're still within the bounds of the economic model because the economic model says you have to follow the law. Well, that relying on the government to create laws for all of those cases is not going to happen. It's the government's slow to enact laws. It's trying to rely on them to get a law in place before something bad happens is almost impossible. It usually takes something very bad or catastrophic to happen before they consider putting a law in place to prevent that. And so that's a failure. And then it's also not a good model to rely on because businesses can influence the government and they do that through lobbying, right? So if I'm a business that makes a lot of pollution and I don't want the government making a law that says I can't make as much pollution as I currently do, I can spend money to buy politicians' votes, and convince them not to vote for that law to go through. And I'm not sure how that's legal in America, but it is. And so they'd be operating within the bounds of the law according to the economic model, although we could all agree that that's not an ethical thing to do. So the other argument that they bring up is that maximizing happiness does not always mean people get what they want. So just buying goods and being a consumer and being able to buy anything you want doesn't necessarily make you happy. And they've proved this again and again. I know it's the whole money doesn't buy happiness, and everybody would be like, yeah, money would make me a lot happier, right? But they've shown it. They've shown that, like, yes, to a certain extent, like probably more money than most of us make or see. I can't assume for every student who watches this video, but most of us, more money would probably make us happier. But it's a curve, right? So it just goes up. If this is your income and this is your happiness level, like it does increase or sorry, happiness to income. So it increases and then it tapers off. You don't get that much more happier after a certain amount of money, after you can buy the essentials plus some fun things, etc. More money doesn't make you that much happier. And honestly, I do believe that. I believe that we get happiness from relationships and either with ourselves or with other people and other things that money can't buy. So there's that argument. Okay, and then they argue against the private property thing that says that businesses are just the property and they're private property, and therefore you owe the owners the money that the business makes. And the argument against that is that personal property and corporate property are very different things. So my personal ownings and belongings, I have different rights to those things than I do if I had a share in a company. Because stockholders or shareholders, they don't own the company really. They're more like investors. So they give some money into the business, but they don't necessarily then get all control of the business. They just get to keep their money there, or they can decide to move that money. So in the case of somebody investing in a company, if that company starts to make decisions and do socially responsible things that they aren't on board with and they aren't okay with, then they can take their money back and move it into a different company. So they're not legally bound to that company, and they don't own it. It's not their property, it's a shared property, if that makes sense. So finally, the final discussion on this ends with reiterating that just because you're following the law, that does not mean you're being ethical. It's not the same. Laws aren't always clear. Even if you do just follow the law, there's a lot of leeway with interpreting the law. That's why we have lawyers and judges and etc., because there's always different interpretation. So you could interpret a different way that is not as ethical. So we move on to more models, because they argue that the economic model is not really, it's not a great model. And I think most businesses agree with that nowadays, but there are a lot that still argue that the main goal should be profit. So the next model that they talk about is called the moral minimum. And exactly like it sounds, it just means doing the minimum of ethics, of ethical duty that you have to society. And they say that the minimum ethical duty you have to society is to cause no harm. And that's the minimum. Don't cause harm. And then after that, then your next duty should be making a profit for shareholders. And so it's not a very high bar, but it is something, at least, just trying to cause no harm. The problem with this model is that it's really hard to distinguish between am I causing harm or am I preventing harm? And so they give the example of Facebook and then them not policing posts, etc. And so, like, by them not policing posts, are they causing harm to society, or would policing posts be preventing harm? And where does the duty lie there? And then it's also hard sometimes to distinguish between preventing harm and doing good. Like, what's the difference there? Where sometimes maybe I prevented something bad from happening, but that's going above and beyond. So I was actually just doing good. And where does that definition lie? So there's just a lot of confusion there. It's not a very clear model. It's a little difficult to apply sometimes. And you'd have to look at every single case, like, okay, what does it mean to cause no harm in this situation? So another model that they look at is stakeholder model. And this model says that all people have equal rights and that all people are equal. And so shareholders are not any better than consumers, or they don't have more weight. They shouldn't have more weight or more say-so than consumers or employees or anybody else who is impacted by the decision of a company. So if I am a manager and I'm trying to make a decision, my job should be then to equally determine how everyone is affected and try to say, oh, take all of the stakeholders into consideration. So it's a little confusing. Stakeholders are anybody who's impacted. Shareholders are people who own shares in the company, so the owners, quotations, of the company. So these owners or these shareholders are not higher in the hierarchy than everybody else when it comes to decision making. They are equal with everybody else. So everybody has to be accounted for. And the main problem with this model is, once again, it's hard to apply, because how do you take into account every single person who's impacted by a business decision and how happy or not happy they're going to be by that decision? And so it's not the best guidance, but it at least takes everybody into account instead of just prioritizing the shareholders. And finally, the last one they look at is the strategic model of corporate social responsibility. And this, I think, is becoming much more popular. It is almost expected of companies nowadays to participate in society beyond just making a profit. And we are better now at holding corporations responsible for being part of society and being a positive force in that society. We call corporations or businesses out all the time when they do things that we don't feel is right. And with social media, it's so much easier to call them out on that and share stories and things that they have done wrong. And so by sharing this information, it does hurt their profit. Consumers can choose to not shop there anymore. And that happens all the time now. It's really common, actually. If a business decides to do something that's not in the ethical views of their consumers, the consumers stop going there and stop shopping there. And so now it's a strategy and strategic model to be socially responsible and to have a corporate social responsibility statement and to have goals there. And some businesses go way above and beyond that. And some are pretty normal, like you would expect them to be socially responsible, like charities and not-for-profits, animal shelters, etc. Those types of places are expected to be socially responsible, but there's also for-profits that weave social responsibility into their core mission. So they make it their goal to give back to society, and that is their business goal. And yes, they make a profit as well. And so these are called benefit corporations or B Corps. And they are trying to make a profit and they want to make a profit, but they're using the profit as a means to the end instead of just trying to make a profit. They're trying to do something with that profit, and their goal is to do something for society. And so they want to keep functioning as a good business and a strong business and making a profit because they can then use that profit for good. And it's a really strong model of a corporation. And honestly, like probably the most ethical out of all these models. But we can't expect every single business to have that as their core goal. There's still going to be plenty of businesses that just try to make a profit or at least do the moral minimum or at least do the stakeholder model. But for those businesses that are going above and beyond, they're really connecting with consumers, and it is a driving trend to be more socially responsible. Okay, and I think that wraps up all the models, the different models. So hopefully that wasn't too confusing. And we'll see you guys for chapter 4. Thanks.